Good evening. My name is Edric Solen. I'm a storyteller and a historian of forgotten things. Tonight I invite you to sit beside the fire. Let the world grow quiet around you. Let the weight of the day slip softly from your shoulders. Because where we're going is far from here. Back through centuries of silence and snowfall. Back to the winter of the year 1315. A time when the sky itself seemed to close. When the rains came and did not stop. When people looked to the heavens, not for light, but for mercy. This was no ordinary winter. It was a season of hunger, of fear, of firelight and frostbite. And it began not with a scream, but with a whisper. A single gust of wind, a frozen breath on a sleeping child's cheek. A church bell that would not ring, locked in ice. Come now, draw your blanket closer. Let the candle burn low, and follow me. Into the dark. The first frost did not roar. It did not come with thunder or storm or fury. It came quietly. A thin layer of silver on a wooden windowsill. The breath of morning animals visible in the dim light. A bucket of water, iced over. Just slightly. Enough to make the farmer pause. In the village, no one spoke of it yet. They stepped a bit faster, wrapped their cloaks a bit tighter, lit the fire a little earlier than usual, but they all felt it. The air was thinner, the clouds lower, the sun just a little more reluctant to rise. Autumn was fading, and something else was coming, something heavier. The trees had lost their colors early. Oranges, reds, and golds, all stripped away in a single week of cruel wind. Now only the bones of the forest remained, black branches clawing at a pale gray sky. The fields had been muddy for days, too muddy to plant, too soaked to walk without sinking. The grain sacks were already light. The cellars smelled of mold, and still, the rain would not stop. By the firelight, the elders spoke of omens, of seasons like this one, long ago, when the crops failed, and the river froze, and people disappeared without sound. But outside, in the barns and corners of stone houses, the young did not listen. They still laughed, still stole apples, still chased chickens across muddy yards. Because it was just a chill, wasn't it? Just another cold morning. Just a bit of frost. But deep beneath the ground, beneath the roots and bones and buried seeds, the earth knew. Winter had awakened, and it was hungry. The homes were low, with sagging beams and damp corners. Roofs leaked. Windows were nothing more than stretched linen or old horn. When the wind blew, it whistled through the rafters like a warning. Outside, the fields stood empty. Black with mud and rot. The wheat should have been high and golden months ago. Instead, it lay drowned, a season's hope lost to the rain. People worked not to grow, but to stay warm. Children gathered twigs in the woods. Old women fed straw into ovens, as if each stalk were a prayer. Fathers stacked what little wood remained with reverence, like counting coins before a final purchase. Each ember was precious. In the dark corners of these cottages, lives were paused. Time stretched. There were no clocks, only the slow drip of melted snow, the creak of timbers, the hiss of wet logs, and silence. So much silence. Even the dogs didn't bark anymore. At night, families curled together like nesting birds. Mothers, fathers, children, cousins, all under the same patchwork of furs, straw, and faded wool. The fire was left to smolder, not to flame, to preserve every last breath of warmth. Some nights it went out, and when it did, someone would wake with a gasp, a cold shock in the lungs, and fumble in the dark for a coal, a splinter, a spark. The fire wasn't comfort anymore. It was the difference between mourning and never waking again. They whispered stories in those freezing hours, of saints who lit fires with a glance, of devils that lived in the chimney smoke, of wolves that turned into men under the moon. No one believed, but everyone listened, because stories, like fire, were warmth too. Even the wealthier homes, those with thick stone walls and proper chimneys, were not spared. The cold slipped through them as easily as breath. In manors and monasteries alike, cloaks were doubled, wine was mulled, prayers were spoken over frost-bitten toes. Scribes wrote with gloves on, ink freezing in its well. The bells of the abbey rang slower now, their sound dulled by snow and ice, as if the heavens themselves had grown tired of winter's toll. Outside, the animals suffered too. Cows huddled together in frost-covered barns. Pigs squealed when their troughs froze. Chickens stopped laying altogether. Some froze where they stood. Their owners wept, not from sorrow, but from the knowledge that meat was gone, milk was gone, eggs were gone, and the snow had not even begun to fall in earnest. Soon the rationing began. Small loaves, thinner broth. Bowls passed down the line, scraped clean, licked dry. Children cried at night not from fear, but from the gnawing ache in their bellies. And yet, they learned to stop asking. The look in their mother's eyes told them there was nothing left to give. In those weeks, a new kind of silence took over, not the quiet of snow, but the quiet of hunger. A silence that hummed in the bones, slowed the thoughts, dulled the senses. People began to move less, to speak less, to dream less. Even hope, it seemed, had gone into hiding. But still, the smoke rose, from every hearth, from every home, like signals sent to the sky. We are still here. We are still here. And for now, that was enough. It began with the mud, thick, black, unrelenting. It swallowed boots, twisted ankles, and cracked wagon wheels. Every trail became a trap, every step a decision. Merchants cursed it. Peasants avoided it. Even animals, usually indifferent to filth, hesitated. The roads, if they could be called that, were already vanishing. And then, the frost came. Overnight, the world stiffened. Ruts and hoof prints froze in place, locked in time. The puddles became jagged mirrors, and the mud became ice. Wagons refused to roll. Oxen slipped and strained. Cart drivers whipped and begged and shouted. But it was no use. The path was gone. Trade, the lifeblood of the medieval village, simply stopped. No grain arrived. No salt. No oil. No wine. No cheese from the south. No news from beyond the hills. The village was cut off, surrounded by white fields, black trees, and silence. The silence was not peaceful. It was the kind that hummed beneath the surface, a waiting kind of quiet, the kind that made people whisper even in their own homes. Some said the forest was cursed this year. Others blamed the rains, or the stars, or the sins of their neighbors. But all agreed on one thing. The roads had betrayed them. Travelers who left for nearby towns never returned. A tanner who went to fetch salt was found days later, frozen to death near a creek, his hand still clutched around a wooden pouch. His horse? Gone. His eyes? Open. Children were warned. Do not follow the road. Do not go into the woods. Stay near the fire. Always. The church, once a place of comfort, grew cold. Literally. The stones held no warmth. The candles barely kept the shadows at bay. Priests gave sermons with trembling hands, breath clouding the air with each prayer. Even the statues seemed colder, as if the saints themselves were retreating inward. Once a week, a desperate few still tried the path. Wrapped in every scrap of wool they could find, they set off, to beg for grain, to find lost kin, to bring word of help. They rarely came back. When they did, they were thin as sticks, eyes sunken, frostbitten, changed. Some spoke of entire towns buried in snow, of wolves that walked like men, of abandoned churches filled with snow and birds. Others said nothing at all. They simply returned, sat by the fire, and stared. And so, the path became a thing of fear. Even in daylight, it was avoided. By midwinter, it was no longer a road, just a ribbon of white dust, stretching into emptiness. Footprints vanished within minutes. The wind erased everything. It was as if the world itself was trying to forget. As January deepened, even the rivers froze. Thick sheets of ice silenced the water's voice. The mill wheels stopped turning. Fish traps yielded nothing but silence. And where once there had been the bubbling comfort of flowing water, there was now only a cold, dead hush. The villagers stopped counting days. They measured time in firewood, in frostbite, in the distance between one snowfall and the next. Some kept calendars scratched into wood with charcoal, not to know what day it was, but to know how long they had lasted. The midwife in the village, old Bruna, toothless and wise, said it reminded her of the winter of the comet, when the sky had bled red and children had been born blind. She claimed to hear voices in the wind again. Not spirits, she saw. Aid, something older. Most laughed, but no one laughed when her cat disappeared, and even fewer laughed when her husband was found frozen at the edge of the path, kneeling, hands clasped, eyes wide, as if he'd seen something just before the end. The isolation changed people. Neighbors who once shared bread now turned away. Gates stayed shut. Dogs growled through fences. Trust withered, just like the herbs on the window ledge, just like the food in the cellar. No one knocked anymore. No one visited. The path between homes, once worn by daily life, vanished beneath unbroken snow. One night, the moon rose full and white, so bright it lit the fields like day. And for a moment, everything shimmered. The snow glowed like silver. The bare trees stood tall like frozen sentinels. A few dared step outside, not out of courage, but because they missed the feeling of space, of sky. They walked slowly, listening to the snow crunch beneath their feet, hearing the sound of their own breath like a drum in their ears. Then they saw it. At the edge of the field, a figure, too still to be alive, too far to be familiar, just standing there, watching. When they looked again, it was gone. The path played tricks now, or maybe it revealed truths no one wanted. Those who tried to map it again, to mark it with branches or stones, found their markers buried by morning, or moved, or gone. One farmer tried tying ropes from his house to the next. He got lost between his own front door and his brother's stable. When they found him, he'd torn the rope with his bare hands. He kept muttering, "There was no house. There was no house." By late February, the path was not just avoided, it was feared. It became something else. A place where people vanished. A space where sound did not carry. A blank stretch of white that felt hungry. Children were told stories of the White Sisters who walked the roads in silence, gathering the lonely. Of the Frost Man who watched from the trees and chose who would fall asleep and not wake up. Of a road that went in a circle, and if you walked it too long, you'd meet yourself coming back. But you'd be changed. Some, of course, scoffed, but even they stepped more carefully when crossing the path. Even they looked behind them, just once. The few who still dared to walk it did so in silence. No carts, no lanterns, no noise, only cloaks pulled tight, eyes down, thoughts full of prayers. Not for safe passage, but for remembering the way back. And one by one, they stopped walking. Not by decree, not by fear alone, but because they no longer believed anything lay beyond it. Not help, not warmth, not salvation, only more cold, more snow, more forgotten footsteps. So the path was left to the wind. It wandered now, over fields, through forests, across hills, shifting, disappearing, becoming something no map could hold. And the village? The village turned inward, pulled tighter, closed itself like a clenched fist, because the path was no longer a way out. It was a warning. And so the world grew quieter still. The wind kept blowing, but no one followed it. The snow kept falling, but no one marked its depth. The road that once welcomed boots, carts, and voices was now nothing but memory, a trail only the cold dared walk. Even the trees seemed to lean away from it. Even the birds no longer circled above. Inside the cottages, the fire was everything. A single flame meant life. A single ember, survival. The path was forgotten. And the people? They did what they had to do. They stayed. They endured. And they waited. Not for rescue. Not for change. Not even for spring. They waited for the cold to grow tired. They waited for the silence to blink first. There is a moment in every harsh winter when the body stops asking. It no longer growls with hunger. It simply slows and waits. In the beginning, there was hope. The villagers had stored what they could: sacks of barley, wheels of hard cheese, clay pots filled with dried peas, smoked strips of meat hung from the rafters like forgotten garments. The baker's family had flour. The butcher had salted pork. The abbey had wine. And everyone else had less. But the storm didn't care what you stored. Lasted longer than anyone planned for. By the second month of the freeze, the food stores were no longer full. They were memories. And the memory of food can be crueler than its absence. Mothers began feeding their children first, pretending not to be hungry. Fathers ate what was left after. Elders often said nothing at all, just pushed their bowl away with a thin smile and the words, "I'm not hungry today." They were always lying, and they were always the first to go. The bread changed first, no longer round and golden, no longer thick with wheat or warm to the touch. Now it was thinner, harder, darker, mixed with ground acorns, sometimes bark, sometimes less explainable things. One woman ground old bones into powder and added them to her dough. She said it gave strength. She said it was better than wasting. The children noticed first. Their energy vanished. Their cheeks sank. Their laughter stopped echoing in the alleys. They still played, but slowly. They still sang, but only songs that whispered. They dreamed of apples, of honey, of loaves so big they could use them as pillows. One boy in the village, no more than 6, told his sister, "I saw bread in the firelight. It was smiling at me." She believed him. Because in winter, everything begins to talk, even hunger. The dogs were the next to vanish. Not all at once, just 1 or 2 each night. At first it was blamed on wolves, then thieves. Then, no one asked anymore. A quiet understanding settled over the village. When the fire dies, you eat what you must. Meat is meat, and survival does not leave room for mourning. One family boiled their leather shoes to make broth. Another crushed frozen nettles into soup. Another, well, no one asked what they did. But they lived. By the 3rd month, Nez began to appear. Not buried, not honored, just bones. Beside cottages, at the edge of fences, beneath beds. Goat bones, cow bones, bird bones, other bones. They were dried, cracked, cleaned, boiled again and again until they gave up what little they had, then thrown aside and walked around. Like stones. The baker no longer baked. There was no flour. The oven stood cold, its ash long settled. He spent his days carving bits of wood into the shape of bread. He said it helped the children sleep. and oddly, it did. One girl held her wooden bread at night like a doll. She kissed it each morning. She called it supper. The church fasts were ignored now. Even the priests admitted this suffering did not need to be made holy. God was silent, not cruel, not angry, just quiet. And in the quiet, people made choices. Not all of them proud, not all of them remembered, but all of them necessary. In the manor house, things were better, for a while. The Lord's table still held meat, salted venison, dried figs from the last trade caravan. Barrels of wine tapped slowly, cautiously. But even there, the walls could not keep the cold out. Nor could status keep the hunger at bay forever. The servants were thinned. The dogs grew sick. The horses stopped answering their names. The cook, once a man of pride and spices, now stirred pots of onion peel and boiled oats. He cried one night in the pantry, holding a single turnip as if it were a pearl. The lady of the house stopped wearing her rings. They were traded for flour. She said it didn't matter. She no longer had the strength to lift her hands anyway. The abbey fared worse. Their faith was strong, but bread cannot be prayed into existence. Even the monks, stoic and silent, began to falter. They rationed communion wine. They watered the broth until it was no longer broth. They heated the chapel with their own breath. Dozens gathered in prayer, mouths steaming in unison. They sang softly, hymns rising like mist toward the high beams of the nave. One monk, Brother Alain, starved himself for others. He died kneeling. The page of scripture before him was frozen stiff. His last breath had iced across the ink. They buried him in the garden, but the ground was too hard for digging. So they covered him with stones and sang. There were no more markets. No one came to trade. No one came to beg. The old square, once filled with laughter and barter, stood empty. Snow drifted up to the windows. Signs creaked in the wind. A single apple core lay half buried near the old well. It had teeth marks. No one touched it, but everyone noticed it. In a home near the edge of the village, a mother melted snow over the fire. She had nothing to add to it. No herbs, no fat, no salt. But the warmth helped her son pretend it was soup. She told him stories of a land where the rivers ran warm even in winter, where trees bore fruit in January, where ovens never went cold. He asked if they would go there. She said yes. He asked when. She said, soon, when the snow has finished eating the sky. He smiled. He didn't understand the sadness in her voice. Dreams changed. People stopped dreaming of spring. They dreamed of roasted meat, of butter, of blackberries and thick cream, of full bellies and full tables, of a single warm biscuit on a wooden plate. Some said they could smell bread in their sleep. Some woke licking their fingers. Some didn't wake at all. But even in this darkness, there were sparks. One boy learned to catch birds with a snare. He fed his entire street one evening with a blackbird stew. A woman taught children how to make a soup from pine needles, bitter but warm. Another carved spoons from old fence wood and gave them to families. So you'll be ready when the broth returns, she said. She called them hope sticks. They were held like relics. Still, bones piled up. And every home, every hearth, every heart was tired. But no one gave up. Because in that village, even hunger had a name. And it was not the name of death. It was the name of endurance. By the 4th month, the hunger had settled in like a tenant. It paid no rent. It obeyed no rules. It simply stayed, sleeping in corners, sitting at empty tables, waiting. It changed people. Not violently, but slowly, like water carving stone. There were whispers now, of old methods, dark remedies. People remembered things their grandparents had once said in hushed tones when the fire burned low. Boil the bark 3 times. The third is edible. The roots of frost thistle won't kill you, but they'll make you forget you're hungry. If it's green and it doesn't hiss, it's food. Old knowledge rose up like steam from forgotten kettles. And still, it was not enough. Some began to hear things. Not voices exactly, but presence. Soundless questions. Unseen gazes. A woman said her cupboard wept at night. A boy claimed his shadow was eating behind his back. The baker's daughter stood in the yard one morning, eyes fixed on nothing, and said, "The cold is chewing on the bones of the sky." No one questioned her. Not anymore. In a hut on the edge of the woods, a man lived alone. He had once been a soldier. Now he stirred snow and moss in a dented pot. He talked to his sword, which he still kept by the door. Called it Loaf. Every night he tapped its hilt and said, "We'll eat tomorrow, old friend." He was not mad. Not truly. He was simply alone. And even loneliness is something that can be boiled, if you're careful. But amidst it all, life continued. Babies were born. Laughter flickered like firelight, faint but real. One couple married beneath an old oak, wrapped in furs and surrounded by neighbors holding candles instead of flowers. The ceremony lasted 4 minutes, but it was 4 minutes where the village felt warm again. And sometimes, that's all it takes. They had begun rationing not just food, but words. People saved their strength, used nods, gestures. A look became a whole conversation. But one ma, and the old schoolmaster, did the opposite. He spoke constantly, told stories, even when no one asked, recited poetry with frost clinging to his beard. When asked why, he smiled and said, "Because hunger hates music. It can eat your body, but never the rhythm of a good rhyme." The bones of the animals were now brittle from so many boilings. Some were ground into paste and smeared on crusts of bark. Some were saved, carved into charms, talismans against the cold. One woman tied tiny bones into her daughter's hair. "To keep the wolves away," she said. The girl believed her. Sometimes belief is the only meal left. But the greatest hunger wasn't in the stomach. It was in the eyes. The hunger for sunlight, for green, for the sound of a market, for the scent of herbs, for the creak of a boat on the river, for color. Everything was white, gray, ash. People began painting dreams in their minds. Brilliant, blooming, rich dreams of gardens and cakes and golden meadows. A boy who hadn't spoken in weeks suddenly stood and said, "The snow is lying. I saw a flower under it." No one corrected him, because maybe it was true. At the center of the village stood a tree, old, gnarled, leafless, its bark cracked and its roots twisted deep into frozen soil. In warmer times, it shaded the market stalls. Children climbed it. Lovers carved initials into its skin. Now, it stood as still as stone, and beneath it, people left things. Not prayers, not flowers, but scraps, bones, bits of cloth. It became a kind of altar, not to any god, but to the idea that someone, somewhere, might be listening. Someone who could end the hunger. The snow didn't fall every day anymore. Sometimes the sky was just empty, a blank dome above a hollow world. But the cold remained, and so did the silence. It was during one such still afternoon that the bell at the church rang. Only once. A long, low note, as if the rope had been pulled by someone unsure. It rang again. People stepped out of homes, looked toward the steeple. They gathered, and when they entered, they found Brother Léon standing alone beside a barrel. In it, 6 small loaves of bread. Not much, but more than anyone had seen in weeks. He said nothing, just nodded once and gestured for the crowd to come. One by one, they broke the bread, tore it gently, held it in their hands like relics, shared it in pieces. No one took more than they should. No one asked where it came from. It didn't matter. In that moment, the bread wasn't food. It was proof. Proof that something still remained, that some spark of compassion, of miracle, of mercy had not yet gone out. That night, the village was quiet, not with fear, not with sorrow, but with the hush that comes after a long breath is finally released. Fires were lit with more confidence. Doors stayed open a little longer. And though stomachs still ached, the ache felt different, less like punishment, more like endurance. In one cottage, an old woman stood stirring a pot of melta, snow and pine tips. To her grandchildren, she said, "It's not the food that fills you, it's the knowing there will be food again." They didn't understand, but they smiled anyway. A man with frost-bitten fingers carved a piece of wood into the shape of a chicken. He gave it to a girl who hadn't spoken in days. She named it dinner, and then she laughed. Just once. But it echoed. By the end of that week, something had changed. Not the weather, not the hunger, but the people. They moved with a little more purpose. They nodded to each other again. They stopped avoiding their reflections in frozen puddles. And beneath the cold, beneath the ache, beneath the bone, a thought stirred. A thought that had not dared to surface in months. Maybe we will survive. High on the hill, above the frost-laced roofs of the village, the manor house stood. Stone walls, tall windows, fireplaces big enough to stand inside. Tapestries fluttered in drafty corridors like tired flags. It was warm there once, filled with music, laughter, the clinking of goblets and silver plates piled high. Now it echoed. The lord, Sir Emeric of Calmere, sat at the head of his table each evening, staring at what remained. Gone were the haunches of venison. Gone the glazed pheasants and honeyed pears. Gone even the gooseberry wine from the southern coast. In their place, turnips, hard as stone, pickled beets, sour and soft, dry heels of bread dipped in watered broth. It was still a meal, but it was no longer a feast. Across from him sat his daughter, Lady Eleanor, once radiant, once flushed with youth and courtly rumors, now pale, now quiet. Her hands, once wrapped in silk gloves, were bare and pink from washing floors. She still lit the candles in the dining hall each night, not for beauty, but for habit, for memory. Because even when the world collapses, ritual remains. They still had servants, a few. Old, loyal, tired. The steward, Tolan, still wore his vest of office. Though it no longer fit his frame, he counted rations like prayers, checked the meat hooks in the cellar. Empty. He opened the wine cellar, only to close it again. Nothing there but dust and echo. Meanwhile, below, in the village, a woman boiled a leather belt for soup. A boy gnawed on the rind of a cheese that had gone green months ago. A man chewed moss. A girl scraped the inside of a pot with her fingernails, then licked her fingers like they held honey. The divide was no longer just wealth. It was distance. It was who you could afford to forget. But winter does not care for bloodlines, and hunger does not recognize titles. One morning, the Lord's cook did not come. He was found in the stable, a bottle beside him, a note beneath him. "Forgive me. I cannot feed ghosts." That night, Sir Emeric walked to the village. For the first time in years, he wore a thick cloak, lined with fur that once came from the east. At first, no one recognized him. He stood outside the baker's ruin, watched a woman feed snow to her baby. He said nothing. When she noticed him, she didn't bow. She didn't beg. She just looked at him and said, "Do you have bread?" He shook his head. "Then you're one of us." The next day, Sir Emeric did something no one expected. He opened the manor gates. They creaked like bones waking from sleep. A few villagers came, curious, cautious. They expected charity. They found a table, long, empty, cold, set for 10, with food enough for 2. Lady Eleanor met them in the hall. She wore no jewels, only a linen shawl patched at the edges. She smiled thinly. "You are our guests," she said, "and we are your neighbors." A pot was brought forward, thin stew, root vegetables, and the last of the dried venison. They shared it, all of them. 7 strangers and 2 nobles, sitting shoulder to shoulder on benches once reserved for kings' messengers and foreign lords. No one spoke of titles. No one asked permission. They ate, in silence. Word spread. The manor gates stayed open. Each day, a few more came. A boy with frostbitten hands, an old man who hadn't spoken in weeks, a mother and her 2 children, one of whom had stopped walking. There was never enough food. But there was always a seat. The lord's cellar, once rich with barrels and crates, grew bare. The tapestry in the great hall was taken down, traded for a sack of potatoes. A jeweled goblet was melted. The silver spoon set gifted by a visiting prince became 3 coins of copper, then 3 loaves of barley bread. Lady Eleanor gave up her comb, her earrings, even her riding cloak, bartered to a traveling monk in exchange for dried fish and candles. She kept only one thing, a ribbon, once red, now faded, wrapped around her wrist like a memory of color. And yet, even with the nobles' offerings, it was not enough. Because hunger is a hole that deepens the more you look into it. In the village, jealousy brewed. Some said the lords were only doing it for pride. Others claimed they had secret stores, meat buried in the snow, butter locked away in stone jars. One man shouted, "They feed us now, but where were they when the first frost came?" Another spat in the dirt outside the gate. Yet the next morning, he was there again, waiting, empty bowl in hand, because principle is a poor substitute for bread. Sir Emeric grew thinner. His once bold shoulders bent. His boots no longer shined. His beard went wild. But his eyes grew softer. Less like a hawk's, more like a man who had finally learned how to see. One night, a storm rolled in. Ice struck the windows like thrown coins. The fire hissed with wind. Inside the manor hall, the villagers and nobles huddled together on rush mats and folded cloth. One woman, teeth chattering, whispered, "Do you remember feasts?" An old shepherd replied, "I remember warmth." No one said anything for a while. Then someone, no one knew who, began to hum. A slow, soft tune. No words, just the shape of a lullaby. And in the dark, amid hunger, stranger, it's joined in. One voice, then 2, then many. The song carried no language, only memory. By the 5th week, the manor no longer felt like a lord's home. The tapestries were gone, the rugs used as bedding, the walls bare, showing the cracks beneath plaster. No guards, no velvet, just people. Coughing, sleeping, boiling roots, telling stories. Children played with broken candlesticks. Women sang softly while stirring pots of snow and weeds. Old men played dice with seeds instead of coins. It was no longer a manor. It was a refuge, a large, crumbling heart still beating in the cold. Sir Emeric no longer sat at the head of the table. He sat wherever there was room. One morning, he helped dig out the well. He swung a rusted shovel like a farmer. His gloves tore. His hands bled. He said nothing of it. That evening, a girl handed him a scrap of cloth to wrap his palm. It had once been part of a wedding dress. She said, "Mama said, when you give something away, it becomes something better. He nodded, and for a moment, he believed her. Food still came, here and there. A merchant wandered in with salted fish. A trapper brought frozen rabbits, stringy but precious. A monk returned with black bread and pickled cabbage from a nearby abbey. Not enough to feast, but enough to believe. Lady Eleanor started a book, scraps of parchment tied with ribbon. In it, she wrote the names of every person who came to the manor, not as a ledger, but as remembrance. When asked why, she said, "The dead should not outnumber the remembered." She left space beside each name, for when spring came, for when they could return, for when survival became memory. Then came the day when the doors would not close. Too many people, too many blankets, too many cold bodies pressed together. And so, the fire was moved outside. To the great stone circle once used for summer festivals, logs were stacked, chairs brought down, bedding made into tents. And around the fire, nobles and peasants sat without distinction. The manor behind them darkened, because light now belonged to all. A boy from the village asked Eleanor, "What's it like to be a lady?" She smiled, thin and honest. "Right now, it feels like being everyone else." He nodded, then offered her the last bite of his turnip. Later that night, it snowed again. Soft flakes, no wind, no sound. Someone placed an old silver plate in the center of the fire circle. Upon it, a piece of bread, half an apple, and a coin. No one touched it. It was not for eating. It was not for trading. It was an offering, not to gods, but to each other. It began with a cough, just one. Dry, small, the kind that barely stirs the air. But in a room full of thin lungs and shared blankets, one cough is enough to wake the wolves. By late winter, the people were ready for almost anything, except this. They had braved hunger, survived the frost, lived on broth made from bark and dreams. But sickness was something different. It did not announce itself, with snow. It did not wait at the door like famine. It slipped in, quietly, politely, and stayed. The first to fall was a boy, 8 years old, red hair, cheeks that still held color, even when everyone else had gone pale. He'd been cheerful just the day before, playing in the snow with a spoon tied to a stick, pretending to stir stew. By morning, he was hot to the touch, not warm, burning, breath shallow, skin slick with sweat that had no place in winter. He died by dusk. No one touched the body for hours, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The healers had little to offer: a cloth soaked in vinegar, steam from boiled herbs, whispers of garlic and onion tucked under pillows. Some prayed. Some burned dried juniper. A few tried silence, as if the sickness might not see them if they didn't speak its name. But names didn't matter. The cough spread. To women, men, children, to those who had shared blankets, and to those who hadn't. A man who had not left his home in weeks was found wheezing alone, face gray, lips blue. Sir Emmerich turned the manor's lower hall into a sick room. He didn't ask permission. He just laid down mats, placed buckets of water, and opened every shutter to let in what little air the world had left. Lady Eleanor sewed cloth masks. She did not know if they worked, but she said, "It gives people something to hold between them and fear." That, sometimes, is enough. They wrapped the sick in old cloaks, patted their backs with straw, fed them boiled snow and honey if they had it. Some recovered. Most did not. The graveyard had long since frozen, so the dead were wrapped and carried to the edge of the woods, laid under stones, not buried, not forgotten, just set aside until the thaw. In the village, rumors bloomed like rot. It came from the bread. No, from the snow. From the new strangers. From the priest. From the nobles. From sin. Everyone was a suspect. Everyone a potential source. Fear does that. It feeds on the invisible. On things we cannot prove, only feel. And still, others stepped forward. The baker's wife, who had lost 2 sons already, became a nurse. She carried broth, held hands, whispered lullabies to people she barely knew. When asked why, she said, "Because I still have hands to hold with." It wasn't just cough and fever. Some lost their senses. They spoke to people who weren't there. They wandered at night, barefoot in the snow, whispering songs from childhood. One man tried to dig into the stone floor with his hands, claiming he could feel spring beneath it. No one stopped him. Some even knelt to help, because if hope lives underground, then maybe, just maybe, the frost can be broken. The sickness moved quickly, but unevenly. Some homes lost everyone. Others, untouched. A girl who had shared a blanket with 2 fevered brothers remained strong. A priest who had never left his cell died without a mark on him. A baby, born in the middle of the storm, opened her eyes, cried once, then fell silent, and not from death, but sleep. She slept for 2 days. When she woke, she smiled. Whispers became rituals. Strangers began leaving bundles of herbs outside sick rooms. Mint, thyme, pine needles bound with strips of cloth. No names, no knocking, just quiet offerings. A bowl of snow, carefully melted. An old comb to ease the scalp of the bedridden. A spoon carved from cherry wood. Smooth, clean, beautiful. Lady Eleanor began reciting names aloud each morning. Every person in the manor. Every sick child. Every elder lost the night before. She did not ask for prayer, only memory. Because remembering is resistance. When asked why she did it, she said, "If we forget them, the sickness wins twice." One evening, Brother Leon arrived at the manor with a cart. Not of food, not of medicine, but books, wrapped in linen. Some cracked, some full of mold, some unread for years. He said, "Let the sick sleep to the sound of stories." That night, villagers took turns reading aloud. A page from A Tale of a Night and a River of Stars. A poem about summer peaches. A riddle in Latin that no one could solve, but made them laugh anyway. Even in fevered rooms, the air changed. Lighter. Wider. Like the sickness had been made to share space. Not all could be saved, but not all were lost. And as the snow began to fall less often, as the air shifted, just slightly, as birds were spotted again at the edge of the trees, so too did the coughing slow. Not vanish. Not yet. But lessen. And that, for now, was enough. In one cottage, a boy who had not spoken in days sat up. He asked, "Is spring still coming?" His mother wept. Not because of the question, but because she finally believed the answer could be yes. It didn't start with birdsong. It didn't start with sunshine. It began with a drip. One, then another. Then 100. Slow, steady, echoing through the rafters and the trees and the roofs of every home. The snow was melting. Children noticed it first. They watched water trickle down stone walls, saw icicles thin and shiver, heard the creak of earth waking from beneath the crust. And when the ground gave its first squish beneath a boot, not a crunch, someone laughed. It was short. Surprised? Real. There was still snow, yes. Still frost on the edges of windows. Still ice on the corners of buckets. But the sun lingered longer each day. 5 minutes. Then 10. Light spilled across the fields like paint across old parchment. Colors returned. Gray turned brown, white turned silver, and in one corner of the church garden, a single green shoot broke through the dark. No one touched it. It was sacred. The dead remained in their resting places, stones piled, names unspoken, snow still clinging to cloth. But with the thaw came the first chance to dig. The ground softened, graves were made, prayers whispered, songs hummed with cracked voices. Even the sick, if they could stand, came to see them buried. Because the act of burying is not only for the dead, it's how the living say, "We are still here." The manor's great fire pit was doused. The people who had gathered there through the storm returned to their homes, some alone, some in pairs, some with new families, formed not by blood, but by firelight and survival. Sir Emmerich stood in the courtyard, watching them go. He said nothing, but Lady Eleanor placed a book in his hands, the one with all the names. "Read it," she said. "One page each morning, until you remember what we're made of." In the village, ovens were lit again, not for bread, not yet, but to dry herbs, to warm water, to roast roots. A child carried a bundle of mint through the street like a crown. Another placed wild garlic on the doorstep of every home. Spring wasn't here, but it was coming, and that was different. That was everything. The rivers began to speak again, not loudly, just a whisper. A trickle here, a burble there. Ice cracking gently like old joints stretching in the morning. Children gathered near the banks. They dropped pebbles into the thawed pools, listened to the splash like it was music. For months, water had been a threat, frozen, cruel, hard as steel. Now it shimmered. Now it moved. Now it gave again. The hunters returned to the forest, not with traps, just eyes. They watched for hoofprints, for birds, for mushrooms beneath melting bark. One found a badger, still sleeping. Another saw 2 deer, thin, trembling, but alive. He did not raise his bow. Instead, he whispered, "We've both made it then," and turned home empty-handed, but full-hearted. In the church, the bells rang for the first time in weeks, not for mourning, not for warning, but for thanks. A low, gentle peal, not triumphant, but steady. A sound that said, "You have endured." People gathered, sang, prayed. Some laughed, some wept, some just listened. And when the final note faded, no one spoke. They let the silence stay. Because even joy needs space to breathe. The markets returned next. No coins yet. No spice, no silk, no silver scales of dried fish. But trade began. An old man offered firewood in exchange for a cloak. A child swapped eggshell beads for a single onion. A woman with nothing but stories gave them freely to anyone who would listen. And someone gave her bread in return. Not out of pity, but because a story is worth more than gold when you've forgotten how it feels to hope. The snow did not vanish all at once. It lingered in shadows, behind trees, on the roofs. But the air had changed. It no longer bit. It kissed. Cold, still, but kinder. A girl found a beetle crawling across the windowsill. She gasped, cupped it in her hands, showed it to her mother like treasure. "It's moving," she whispered. Her mother nodded. "So are we." In the manor, new candles were lit. Not for survival, not for ritual, just for light. Sir Emmerich wrote letters again. Lady Eleanor planted herbs in the stone planters. A boy came to the gate and offered a single quail egg in exchange for a story. He left with a lee about a prince who defeated winter with nothing but laughter. He promised to come back the next day, with 2 eggs. That night, the stars seemed closer, and for the first time in months, someone opened a window on purpose, just to breathe. It is easy to list what was lost. Food, warmth, sleep, homes, names, voices that will never call out again. But the winter took more than that. It took shape. It took time. It took the rhythm of life and made it vanish. The baker's hands, once dusted with flour each morning, now trembled when near heat. He no longer whistled. He stared at his empty oven like a wound. He said it felt like a grave. The blacksmith, who had not lifted a hammer in 3 moons, touched his tools with something like fear. He confessed to the priest that he'd forgotten the weight of iron, and the sound. When metal sings, it means life is moving, he whispered. It's been so quiet. Children forgot the rules of games. They still ran, but didn't laugh the same. They watched the sky more than each other. One girl carried a snow-covered doll everywhere she went. Its head had broken during the worst week. She still wrapped it in cloth and told it bedtime stories, not because it needed comfort, but because she did. There were new superstitions now. People knocked on door frames 3 times before entering. They never left bowls empty overnight, and they placed a piece of charcoal above every hearth to remind the fire we are still here. The fire. Ah, yes, the fire had saved them and scarred them. In some cottages, the hearth had never gone cold. It had warmed hands, cooked bark, lit stories. But in others, it had eaten more than it gave. One house had caught in the 3rd month, flames so quick, so greedy, they took mother, father, daughter. Only the boy escaped. He hadn't spoken since. He sat in the chapel every day, tracing the grooves in the stone floor, as if trying to remember something no one could give him. The Lord's manor bore its own burns. The grand tapestry room had blackened at the edges. Ash clung to the rafters. Lady Eleanor wept not when the walls cracked, but when the painting of her mother peeled away in the heat. The winter took her twice, she said. The people began to count their losses, not aloud, not all at once, just in glances, in the way hands lingered on door handles, in how quickly the stew was stirred, as if afraid it would vanish again. A man buried a comb beneath the garden, whispering a name no one else knew. Another tied bits of string around every tree in his yard. To remind them, he said, where we are when they wake up. Spring was near, but it did not erase winter. It only softened it. Grief does not leave like frost. It does not melt. It settles, like ash. Fine. Silent. In the folds of memory, in the corners of habit. It waits. And sometimes, it whispers. There was a widow in the village who had lost her husband just before the first snow. He was not taken by hunger or illness, but by accident. He fell through ice while fetching water. They had been married for 27 years. That winter, she refused to burn his chair, even when wood was scarce. She kept it by the fire, untouched, with his scarf draped over the back. People said nothing, but when they visited her, they always left a stick of firewood by her door. Some debts are not spoken aloud. A young man rebuilt his fence each day, even though no animals remained, even though the wind kept knocking it over. It gives me something to fix, he said. Everything else is too broken. The priest no longer preached. Instead, he listened to stories, to regrets, to silence. He placed a bowl of clean water at the altar and told people, wash your hands, leave what you can, take what you need. Some left herbs, some left coins. One child left a drawing of a sun with 7 faces. It was pinned to the wall. It stayed there until midsummer. Rebuilding did not begin with stone or timber. It began with song. Quiet, fractured songs hummed by old voices. New melodies by children who had never known warmth. A woman carved flutes from elderwood. She gave them away freely. And every dusk, a tune rose from the rooftops. Not joyful, just present. People began planting, not with confidence, but with memory. They dug into the still cold ground and whispered, "Let this year be kinder." Fingers sore, backs aching, eyes tired. They dropped seeds into the dirt like prayers. Turnips, cabbage, onion, herbs for tea, marigolds just for beauty. A man wept while planting mint. It was her favorite, he said. The baker reopened his oven. Not with bread. Not yet. With flat cakes, made from barley, salt, and silence. He shaped them into stars. He gave the first one to the girl with the broken doll. For those we carry, he said. She nodded, and ate it whole. By now the snow was gone, but in the corners of yards it still haunted the soil. No one trusted the warmth. It felt fragile, like a lie, like a candle in wind. So they lit candles anyway, one in each window. So the fire knows we still want it, someone said. Sir Emmerich held a feast, not grand, not loud, but everyone came. Villagers, nobles, monks, orphans, widows. They sat on the floor, on crates, on blankets. They passed boiled eggs, thick bread, roots and herbs, and a small roast boar brought by a hunter no one had seen in months. Lady Eleanor stood. She held up a ladle and said, "We made it through the hunger, through the cold, through the silence. Let us now make it through remembering." No one cheered. They just ate. Together. And the eating, that was celebration enough. As the earth softened, people returned to the woods. Not to hunt. Not to take. Just to walk. To listen. They found what the fire had spared. Moss, tiny buds, antlers left in the snow like forgotten crowns. One man said, "It's still here. The world. It waited for us." That spring, no one cleaned the soot from their chimneys. They let it remain. Dark streaks, along white stone. Marks of survival. A few even traced their fingers through the ash each morning, like monks with scripture. It was not superstition, not fear. It was memory, etched in black. A new holiday was born. No one named it. No bells were rung. But every year, on the day the snow first broke, people left bowls of broth on their doorsteps, for the lost, for the hungry, for the cold that could return. No one touched them, but everyone saw, and that was enough. A woman stitched a quilt from every torn scrap in the village, rags from winter cloaks, the corner of an apron, a child's sleeve, a flag that once hung in the manor. It was patched and crooked, bright and strange. When she finished, she hung it in the chapel and said, "This is what we look like now." No one disagreed. Some wrote letters to the dead, not to send, just to speak. Folded pages tucked into cracks in trees, buried with seeds, burned beneath moonlight. They said, "I remember your voice. We still sit where you sat. Your name has not left the room." Sir Emmerich planted apple trees, 12 of them, one for each family that hadn't survived the winter. He marked them not with stones, but with wooden spoons. "So the fruit remembers the hunger," he said. Lady Eleanor read aloud the names from her book, one each evening. By midsummer, she was only halfway through. She kept reading anyway. The chapel bells rang again. But not to mourn, to mark a year. A year since the first frost. A year since the silence began. People gathered. No speeches. No hymns. Just presence. And when the bells fell still, a single child walked forward and placed a stone on the altar. Others followed, until the altar was covered not in gold, not in offerings, but in weight, in memory, in permanence. And so, this is what the fire took. Bread, names, hands, homes, laughter, footsteps, voices that once filled the night. But it did not take everything. It did not take the will to remember, or the courage to begin again. It started, not with a burst, but with a breath. A warmth in the soil, a looseness in the air. The snow, gone now, replaced by fog rising like ghosts into the pale morning. And then, a blade of grass, just one. Thin, green, unimpressive to the eye, but to the soul, thunder. The world had not died. It had slept. In the village, children gathered around the first patch of moss they had seen in months. They touched it with their fingertips like velvet, then pressed their faces to it, laughing. Not a loud laugh, a stunned laugh, like waking from a dream you thought would never end. The river no longer whispered. It spoke. It ran fast and full, cold as memory, clear as new breath. The sound echoed through the valley, a rhythm long forgotten, the voice of the land returning. People left jars at the edge, filling them with river water like it was wine. They held it up to the sun, watched the light dance inside it, and drank slowly, not for thirst, but for thanks. The manor fields, once Situ, racked and dead, now held worms again. The steward wept when he saw the first one. "If the worms have come back," he said, "so will the grain." Lady Eleanor took to walking the edges of the fields every dawn. She did not speak. She carried no staff, no book. She just walked. When asked why, she replied, "Because the land remembers feet, and it has missed ours." A boy planted beans, not because he was told, but because he wanted to watch something rise. A girl laid out bowls of cracked seed for the birds, though none had been seen in weeks. And on the third morning, a thrush came. It landed on the lip of the bowl, pecked once, and sang. The entire street fell silent to listen. No one moved, because when a bird sings after winter, it's not just a song, it's a promise. The green didn't return all at once. It came in brushstrokes, a bloom of nettle behind a fence, a line of moss beneath the chapel, a haze of yellow where wild mustard snuck into broken fields. People began naming colors again, not just green, but sprout, fern, lichen, apple, ash, mint, emerald. A woman with 3 missing teeth grinned as she held a dandelion and whispered, "This is what gold really looks like." The garden behind the blacksmith's cottage came back on its own. No hands tilled it. No feet had touched it. But one morning, there were sprouts. A weed here, a violet there. And somehow, a patch of thyme, tiny and fragrant, the kind his wife had loved before she passed. He knelt in the mud and stared, touched the leaf, breathed deep. He didn't cry. But when he rose, his back seemed straighter than it had in months. Sir Emmerich ordered no rebuilding. Instead, he called for a planting. In the square, where a market once stood, he asked each household to place one item in the soil. Not seed, not crop. A symbol, a bone comb, a rusted horseshoe, a copper button, a doll's hand, a broken cup, a ribbon, a page from a torn book. Lady Eleanor laid down a single hairpin. "So we remember," she said, "not just who we lost, but how we lived before we knew we could." The hole was covered gently. A cross was not raised. A plaque was not carved. Instead, someone planted peas over it. In 6 weeks, they climbed. Children began building things, not for need, for joy. A kite from bark and rags, a swing from rope and an old ox yoke, a wind chime made from bones. When it clattered in the wind, the baker's daughter said, "It sounds like the trees laughing." In the woods, the deer had returned. Not many, but enough. A hunter tracked one for 3 days. On the 4th, he watched it drink at a stream. He lowered his bow, not because he had enough to eat, but because something in him had changed. He said, "We survived by taking. Let us live now by letting go." That evening, he taught the village boys to trap fish instead. Small ones, clean water, gentle hands. They caught 3, returned 2. The 3rd they roasted over alderwood. The smell filled the valley. For the first time in months, a metroodamphiosia, El was eaten not for survival, but for celebration. No one had sung all winter, not truly. There were lullabies, soft hums, a verse muttered into stew, but no song. Not until the tanner's daughter brought out her fiddle. The strings were loose. The bow was worn, but her fingers remembered. She played in the square, quietly, without fanfare. And when she finished, the silence was softer. Someone clapped, someone laughed, and then someone else began to sing. A song with no words, just breath and hope. The villagers began a new ritual. Each morning, at first light, they faced east. No prayers, no chanting, just a moment of stillness. Eyes closed, palms open. They did not ask for anything. They simply received the sun. One boy whispered, "It feels like the sky is touching me back." Lady Eleanor reopened the old library room in the manor. Much had been lost. Damp pages, crumbled bindings. But some remained. She called for stories, written, spoken, remembered. Not history books. Lives. Tales passed down. Jokes once told by fires. How your grandfather fell into the well. How your mother used to throw flour at foxes. A girl recited her mother's favorite riddle. A boy described the dream he had during the worst snow. They called it the Green Ledger, not to count what was planted, but what had grown. At the chapel, the bells rang again, this time in a new pattern. 3 slow tolls, a pause, then one. No one knew who started it. No one claimed it. But it became known as the breath. It rang at midday, a call to pause, to exhale. And slowly, across the valley, people began to rest when they heard it. Just for a minute. Not to grieve. Not to fear. To breathe. In the hills, a child discovered a patch of wild strawberries. He didn't eat them. He brought them to the baker, who placed them in the window, like a jewel. "Not for sale," he said. "For joy." A painter arrived in the village. No one knew her name. She wore blue and carried cloth instead of canvas. She painted on walls, on barns, on broken fences. Images of green vines, gold suns, silver fish, and sleeping foxes. On the old gallows post, now unused and rotted, she painted a nest, with 3 eggs. "Let what once held death now hold life," she said. No one stopped her. No one paid her. But when she left, they followed her footprints in the grass, as if they, too, led to something blooming. The snow never said goodbye. It simply didn't come back. One morning, the wind was soft, the sky was high, and the trees were full of something that felt like breathing. The frost had vanished from the windows, the mud had dried, and when you stepped outside, you no longer braced your body. You just stood and felt. They called it the softening, the time when sorrow loosened its grip, when memory didn't sting so sharply, when the silence inside your chest made room for something else. Not joy. Not yet. But readiness. The graves in the woods were finally covered, with soil, with stones, with flowers. Ye, low and white and small. People spoke names aloud. Some cried. Some smiled. One woman said, "I forgot what it felt like to say his name without fear. Now, I say it with the wind." In the manor's upper tower, someone hung a bell. Not for warning, not for mourning. For arrival. Whenever something new appeared, a bloom, a bird, a birth, the bell was rung once. Soft, joyful, not urgent. Just a sound to say, life has come again. At the river, they held the first festival. There was no crown, no banners, no feast. Just hands joined, feet in the mud. Music without melody. Dancing that looked more like swaying. Sir Emmerich stood by the water's edge. He held no sword, wore no cloak. But when the people bowed to him, he raised a hand and said, "No, today, we are only human." And they wept. Because after all that had been taken, being human still remained. A tree grew in the old chapel yard. No one planted it. It rose between cracked stone and buried boots, straight, strong, quiet. A sign was placed beside it, in memory of ye hunger, in honor of spring. By midsummer, the valley was green again. but not the same green as before. This one was deeper, richer, hard-earned. Every leaf felt like a flag, every flower a hymn. The village had not returned to what it was. It had become what it needed to be. Lady Eleanor closed her book. She tied it with the same ribbon she had worn through winter. She placed it in the chapel. Not for reading, for keeping. The bells rang one final time that season. 3 slow tolls, a pause, then one. You are still here. You have endured. And now, you grow. It began so subtly, many didn't notice. The light. It stopped leaving. There had always been sunrises, yes, but for months they were brief, fleeting, like apologies whispered and quickly taken back. But now, the sun lingered. It sat longer on rooftops. It rested in puddles like gold. It wrapped itself around people's shoulders without asking, and no one told it to go. They called it the still sun days, when even the birds seemed to pause mid-flight. No frost returned, no final snow. The firewood pile went untouched for 3 whole days. A boy placed his hands inside it and said, "It doesn't bite anymore." With warmth came not just comfort, but reckoning. People began to ask questions they had been too cold to consider. What now? What is left of who we were? What do we owe the ones who did not make it? And perhaps hardest of all, who am I now that I am not afraid? The days grew long. Too long, some said. Old farmers squinted at the sky and muttered, "This much light feels suspicious." But most were silent, grateful, awestruck, because when the sun stayed, so did something else. Time. Time to think. Time to sit. Time to notice the colors in a blade of grass. Time to mourn, slowly. For months, mourning had been fast. Quick prayers, cold hands, rushed burials, if any. Now they began to build altars, not of stone, of belongings. A child's boot, a torn ribbon, a cracked wooden cup, a rusted needle, set on shelves, in corners. Not to forget, but to hold. Lady Eleanor called it the archive of things that carried us. Sir Emmerich walked the village alone most mornings, not in armor, not as a leader, just as a man with memory in his shoes. People watched from windows as he passed. He touched every gate, nodded at every child, and whispered blessings beneath his breath. Some said he was naming the streets again, because every path felt new. The manor no longer echoed. Rooms were full again, not with soldiers, but with makers. A weaver, a candle maker, a woman who stitched dolls from flour sacks. In the east wing, someone began singing daily, a prayer or maybe a lullaby. No one asked her to stop. The halls hummed like a hive. One evening, a boy stood beneath the chapel bell. He rang it just once. When asked why, he said, "I wanted to know if it still worked." It did, but it sounded different, lighter, as if the air around it had changed, as if joy, too, has a sound. No one fell in love that winter. There was no time, no warmth, no breath to spare. But when the light stayed, so did glances, so did voices that lingered a moment longer, and laughter, not the sharp bark of desperation, but the quiet, chest-deep kind that makes your shoulders rise and your heart lean forward. A farmer offered the baker's daughter a single pear he'd been saving. It was small, soft, flecked with bruises. He didn't speak, just held it out in his calloused hand. She took it, bit into it, and when juice ran down her chin, she smiled without apology. "It's sweet," she said. "So are you," he answered. And that was the beginning. A woman painted her own front door green, the color of risk, the color of new leaves. When asked why, she replied, "Because I want the birds to notice." They did. 2 finches nested beneath her roof beam a week later. One of the monks began carving again. Not crucifixes, not saints. Animals, dozens of them. Otters, foxes, bears curled in sleep, squirrels perched on acorns, owls with oversized eyes. He placed them in the forest paths, a quiet game of discovery. Children called them the watching ones. They left little bits of bread and berries near their feet. No one told them to. The air smelled different too. Sweeter. Like clover and wet bark. People noticed the way the wind now carried warmth instead of warning. One morning, a girl stood on a hill and spread her arms wide. "I'm flying!" she shouted. "No," her mother said. "You're remembering!" A man proposed marriage using a bowl of water. He placed it on the table between them and whispered, "Let us rise and fall together." She nodded, touched the surface with her finger, said, "Then let us begin." And so they did. The children began to ask questions, not the kind asked out of fear, but out of wonder. Where did the birds go during the frost? Why did the trees sleep so long? Did the stars hide from the cold, too? And more quietly, why didn't Eve, Ryan, wake up? No one had easy answers, but they tried. Lady Eleanor gathered the youngest in the Manor's reading hall each dusk. She read from the old books, not about kings, not about saints, about bread and barns and bees, about the way water changes shape and how moss can find its way through stone. Afterward, she asked, "What did you see today that was alive?" One girl said, "A worm." A boy whispered, "My grandfather." A story wall was built in the village square, just planks of wood, stacked waist-high. People came by with chalk, bits of coal, carved sticks dipped in elderberry juice. They wrote names, drew symbols, left poems that only made sense to the one who wrote them. No one erased anything. There was no need. Sir Emmerich began teaching again. Not swordplay, not defense. He taught hands, how to plant, how to sharpen, how to lift without hurting. He said, "The hand that built the wall now feeds the soil." One boy cried during the lesson, not from pain, from relief. The bell in the chapel rang differently now, twice a week. Once for the past, once for the future. When asked which was which, the priest said, "You'll feel it." Even the animals seemed to know. Birds nested lower in the trees. Rabbits returned to old burrows. A fox was seen sleeping on a doorstep, as if waiting to be invited in. No one chased it. A child buried his last acorn beneath the oldest oak in the woods. "For the next winter," he said, "so it knows we're ready." They began to prepare again, but not the way they had before. Not with dread, with intention. The granary doors were reinforced, not just to guard against rats or rot, but to mark that what lay inside it was sacred. Food meant more now. It was not a measure of wealth, it was a promise. Each sack of barley said, "We do not forget the empty days." People shared seeds like stories, mint wrapped in linen, wild garlic tied with red thread, sunflower seeds tucked into old letters. One woman carved the names of her ancestors onto the handles of her garden tools. "Let them till beside me," she whispered. Tools were no longer just tools. A spade was a legacy, a pot, a prayer. A wooden spoon became an heirloom. Crafts returned. The cobbler sang while he stitched. The wheelwright carved tiny trees into every spoke. A woman began making candles in the shape of eggs and stones and stars. And when someone asked, "Why put beauty into it?" she answered, "Because winter took beauty first." The council gathered not to discuss war or defense, but how to celebrate. They debated music. They argued over where to hang the lanterns. They laughed. One man suggested a new name for the first day of spring. "Let's call it the returning." Someone else proposed a different one. "Let's call it enough." They never settled the debate. But on that first spring morning, every household received a loaf of bread and a handful of dried mint. No message, no decree, just a beginning. And for the first time, children were taught no, or what to fear, but how to dream. The seasons had not changed. The people had. The ones who had hidden in cellars now opened their doors first. The ones who had fallen silent now spoke softly to strangers. The ones who had given up their cloaks in the frost were warmest of all. A grandmother sat beneath a flowering hawthorn. She had survived 5 winters. This one had nearly taken her. She wrapped her shawl tighter and said, "It's not the cold that kills. It's the forgetting." So she told stories, every evening, by the hearth, to whoever would listen, and her fire never went out again. The village square, once a place of ration and silence, became a canvas. Paintings, feathers, bundles of herbs hanging from posts, footprints painted in ash, leading nowhere. They called it the Garden of Made Things. A boy left a bread crust and a feather. A girl braided grasses into a circle. Someone tied a bell to a willow. No one touched it. It rang when the wind passed through. Even the silence changed. It no longer meant fear. It meant rest. Space between stories. A breath before a kiss. A moment between goodbye and tomorrow. Lady Eleanor stopped reading names aloud, not because they were forgotten, because they had been woven in. Each time a loaf was shared, each time a fire was kindled, each time someone said, "This will be enough." Their names were there, carried forward. Sir Emmerich planted a single white rose beside the chapel. When asked why, he said, "Because someday a child will ask what it means, and we will have to answer." And that is how the story ends. Not with a battle, not with a crown, with quiet life, with green returns, and hands held, and seeds sown, and names remembered, with breath, with light that stayed. It wasn't called summer. Not yet. No one dared name it so soon. Instead, they called it the season beyond. Beyond the frost. Beyond the silence. Beyond the hunger. Not an ending. Not a beginning. A wide, slow middle, where life no longer ran, but wandered. Children walked barefoot, not for lack of shoes, but for the joy of feeling warm earth beneath their feet. They ran through fields not yet planted. They played in creeks no longer frozen. And when one child slipped and fell, he laughed, because he was wet and not cold, and that was new. The village no longer spoke in short sentences. People used full thoughts now. Long pauses. Curious questions. "Have you eaten?" became, "What are you planting?" "Are you cold?" became, "Shall we walk together?" Even the animals seemed slower, as if they too had learned to wait, to breathe, to watch the trees sway before choosing a path. Lady Eleanor began writing again, not in the record book, in her own hand. A journal of small things that last. She listed the smell of bread before dawn, a child saying thank you to a tree, a candle that burned longer than expected, the fact that laughter returned without being asked. The bell in the chapel rang only once per week now, not to mark time, to mark presence. "We are still here," it said, "and that is enough." Some things never came back, and that was okay. The butcher's shop remained empty, but the man who once ran it now taught music. He said sharpening a blade and tuning a string weren't so different. The east barn was never rebuilt. Its bones were too broken. So they let the wildflowers take it. Each year, new things grew there. Color no one planted, bees no one summoned, bird song from no known origin. The children called it the Meadow Chapel. They left things in its grass, a drawing, a loaf, a tooth. They never took anything back. The fire pits no longer roared. They glowed, small, steady, soft. People sat longer now. They shared fewer stories, but each one mattered more. A tale told twice was not boring. It was ritual. A boy repeated the same bedtime question every night. What came first, the last snow or the first seed? And each night, someone gave him a different answer. Each one true, each one gentle. A woman carved a sun into every wooden spoon she made. So even soup remembers the light, she said. Old friends who hadn't spoken since the hunger began greeting one another again. They didn't say sorry. They didn't explain the silence. They just said, "You're still here. So are you." And that was enough. They stopped measuring time by days. They measured it by how often the fox returned to the orchard, how many candles lasted past the evening meal, the time it took for bread to rise in a cold room. They measured time by moments that felt real. The priest said fewer words, not from doubt, but from clarity. He stood at the altar, hands open, and said, "Let quiet be your answer tonight." And no one argued. No one moved. The silence stayed like smoke after a candle's breath. A woman rebuilt her garden fence using branches and rope. It wobbled, it creaked, it leaned to one side. But when her neighbor offered stronger wood, she smiled. I like things that look like they're trying. And the fence held. That was all that mattered. A child who had never seen true winter began to draw it with charcoal. What she imagined was soft. Blankets, stars, stew in every bowl. The others watched and smiled. They did not correct her. Why should they? Let the next ones dream their own frost. Sir Emmerich no longer carried a sword. He carried seeds. In his old leather pouch, now patched at the edges, he held tiny pouches wrapped in cloth. Thyme, chamomile, beans, lavender. He walked from door to door, not asking for land or allegiance, only if there was room to grow something new. And when people took the seeds, he simply bowed. A boy watched him from a window and whispered to himself, "That's what a king looks like." They began writing books again, but not histories, books of small things. One titled, "How to Dry Herbs Without Bitterness." Another, "Fireside Questions That Make People Speak." And one, left unsigned, titled simply, "What I Could Not Say in Winter." Inside it, only single lines on each page. I was afraid to ask for help. I still remember the smell of her cloak. One day, I want to plant something just for beauty. I am still here. No publisher came, no noble praised them, but they were copied and passed on, folded in blankets, wrapped in wax cloth, hidden in root cellars for safekeeping. Not because they were precious, because they were true. The field where no crops had grown for 3 years finally softened. A girl ran into it without permission and scattered seeds from her pocket. No rows, no furrows, no order. When asked why, she said, "I want to see what grows wild." And in 4 weeks, color returned. A gathering was held. Not for counsel, not for defense, not even for prayer. Just to sit in the long grass and say the names of the things that returned. The thrush, the stream, a full belly, laughter that doesn't ask forgiveness. Hope that doesn't wear armor, one man added, "You." And everyone stayed silent after that, not because there was nothing more to say, but because that was enough. Lady Eleanor left the manor one morning and did not return for hours. When she came back, her sleeves were covered in dust and pollen. She had gone to walk the roads again, to see which one still remembered her footsteps. A monument was never built, but in the square, someone carved into a fallen beam. We endured. We changed. We stayed. There came a day when no one mentioned the winter, not because it was forgotten, because it was woven in, like smoke in wood, like salt in bread, like grief in laughter. A baby was born during a summer storm. The midwife said he waited for the rain. His father wept, not from sadness, but from the sound of beginning. The old quilts were aired out and folded, not to hide them, to rest them. One was placed in the chapel, another in the library. A third was draped over the statue no one prayed to anymore, only thanked. The candlemaker left a lantern on every doorstep. No note, no name, just flame. Some called it the night of light. Some called it the fire's forgiveness. Others simply called it a kindness. Sir Emmerich, older now, sat beside a tree that had grown from a forgotten apple seed. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and whispered, "We were not meant to last forever, but we were meant to last long enough." Lady Eleanor wrote one final entry in her book. "When the frost returns, and it will, may it find us warmer, wiser, and together." She left the book on the windowsill and walked into the morning mist with a basket of seeds and nothing more. And so it was. No grand monuments, no final wars, no perfect peace, just hands still planting, hearts still beating, names still spoken at dawn. And in that quiet valley, where a great winter once fell like a shadow, the light stayed. And so did they. Peace is not the absence of winter. It is what grows in its shadow. The valley had changed again. Not with storms, not with loss, with stillness. It was not empty. It was quiet. And quiet, they had learned, was something sacred. A new generation had begun to walk the paths, not timidly, not blindly, but with curiosity. They asked different questions than their elders once had. Not, will we survive? But, what shall we become? One child wandered the forest edge, not looking for firewood, but for color. She collected blue feathers, silver stones, and a mushroom that looked like a star. She pressed them into clay and left them at each door in the village. When asked why, she said, "So they remember we're part of the woods, too." The seasons had settled. No more jagged transitions. No more false springs. No cruel snows. Just rhythm. Soft, unbreaking rhythm. Like the swing of a cradle. Or the pulse behind your ribs. A man planted a tree where his mother had once lit candles during the coldest month. He didn't mark it. He didn't fence it. He simply whispered, "Be light, even when I'm gone." And year after year, it bloomed white before any other. They called it the Mother's Moon. The market changed, too. Fewer coins, more trades, more conversations. A fish for a ribbon, a jar of salt for a story, a bag of flour for the promise of a song at dusk. Commerce had become something gentler, not survival, but exchange. The new chapel had no walls, just 4 carved stones at the cardinal directions, a circle of grass, and a bell on a string that anyone could ring. People came there to speak the names of their dreams. Some came to listen to the wind. A young woman knelt there once a week. She never prayed. She just wrote letters to her future self and buried them in glass jars. When asked why, she said, "So I don't forget that I once hoped for this." The old library became a garden, not out of neglect, by design. The books were moved, the shelves dismantled, and in their place, lavender grew in the sunlight. One of the older scribes returned after many months and said, "It's still full of knowledge. Now it just smells better." And Lady Eleanor, now with silver in her braid, no longer led from behind stone walls. She led by sitting beside strangers, by listening, by teaching silence as a kind of wisdom. She said, "We are not a people who endured the cold. We are a people who became warm. There came a time when no one alive remembered the hunger, not firsthand. It had become a story, told at dusk, over stew, by candlelight. But it was not told in fear. It was told like a myth. The great cold, the long silence, the night that lasted years. Children listened wide-eyed. They shivered, but they smiled. Because when the tale ended, they looked outside and saw lanterns. They saw green. They saw their parents dancing in the dark with no shoes. So they asked, "Is it true?" And their elders said, "Yes, and so is this." The first festival of ash and bloom began without a plan. Someone lit a fire in the square. Someone else brought bread. Someone sang a tune no one recognized. A child threw handfuls of petals in the air. They danced. They feasted. They stayed up until the sky turned pink. And the next year, they did it again. And again. Each spring, they added something new. Ribbons tied to trees, seeds given to strangers, a moment of silence just before the last song. They never called it a holy day. They called it a remembering. One young boy carved birds out of soap, dozens of them. He left them on windowsills and fence posts and tucked into coat hoods. When people found them, they smiled. He didn't sign his name. He just said, "They'll fly better if no one owns them." An old woman gathered a group of children and taught them to weave stories from wild grasses. They shaped tales with their fingers. One girl made a braid of 3 strands and said, "This is the story of 3 winters who became one spring." They called her a storyteller. She replied, "No, I'm just someone who listens to plants." By the river, someone had etched a message into stone. We do not forget. We do not fear. We bloom anyway. The oldest ones began leaving gifts in places they once worked. A comb on the library window, a stone mortar in the chapel garden, a pair of wool gloves folded inside the granary door. No names, no ceremony, just offerings. Each one whispered, "What helped me may help you." Sir Emmerich, now white of beard and quiet of step, walked the perimeter of the village every morning, not to guard, to greet. Every tree, every gate, every dog and child and shadow. Sometimes he stopped and pressed his palm to a fence post. Other times, he spoke a single word aloud. "Still. Enough. Grow." He carried no sword, only a cane carved from the same oak that once marked the border of the old winter fields. The cane had 12 notches in it. He said they marked each winter survived. When asked what he feared now, he answered, "Nothing that breathes." Lady Eleanor hosted a circle each month, not a council, not a sermon, just a table, a teapot, and a single question spoken aloud. "What truth have you kept to yourself?" No one was required to answer, but often someone did. A man admitted he still wept when bread browned too quickly. A young mother said she dreamed of snow even in the heat. A girl whispered that she didn't remember the frost at all and felt guilty for her joy. Lady Eleanor never offered solutions, only silence that made space for softness. And in that silence, healing grew. One woman, whose name was never recorded, wrote this on a scrap of linen and left it inside a hollow tree. "We used to light fires to chase away darkness. Now we light them so we can sit together." A girl was born beneath the full moon. She did not cry. She yawned, and they laughed, because it was the most peaceful thing anyone had seen in years. They named her Mira. It meant one who looks back with calm. Her naming day became a village festival, not because of who she might become, because of what she already was. Proof that the story had not been dead. That same week, the villagers rebuilt the eastern barn, not because they needed the space, because they missed the shape of it on the horizon. They used old tools, new timber, and songs no one had sung in years. When it was done, they did not paint it. They let it weather, so it would carry its own story on the outside. The children began to lead the lantern walk. They chose the path. They chose the rhythm of the bells. They carried the fire carefully, not to shine ahead, but to illuminate each other's faces. One child, just 6 years old, stopped at the stream and said, "This is where the moon lives." And everyone paused, just to see what she saw. Sir Emmerich, one evening, stayed by the orchard longer than usual. He looked at the apple blossoms and murmured, "I no longer need to teach. They already remember." He placed his cane on the fence rail, walked home empty-handed, and never brought it back. The next morning, a boy found it. He touched the notches, all 12, and without a word, he leaned it against his own gate. The past no longer stood behind them. It walked beside them. Not as a ghost, not as a wound, as a rhythm, a hum. The youngest no longer asked, "What was the winter like?" They asked, "Why did we survive?" And the answer was never the same, but it always ended with, "So that we could remember warmth." A story was carved into the chapel stones. It had no names, no dates, just one line. We stayed when staying seemed impossible. Beneath it, someone placed a feather, and a loaf, and a child's drawing of the sun. Lady Eleanor walked to the highest hill the morning she knew would be her last as leader. She brought nothing. She took nothing. She simply sat, watched the mist roll, and whispered, "Let them walk without my shadow." By the time someone found her ribbon wrapped around the gate post, the birds had already begun their mourning, and so the valley kept breathing. Seasons passed, hands changed, songs faded and returned in new voices, but the story remained. Not written, not spoken, lived. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath grows slow, you too carry the story. Not in your thoughts, in your rest, in your warmth, in your stillness. Sleep now. The fire is low, the frost is far, and you are part of the long peace now. Before we part ways, let me sit with you a little longer. No more lessons, no more names, no more winters to survive. Only the sound of my voice, the flicker of your thoughts, and the breath between us. You have come far. Farther than you think. Farther than most would dare. Through hunger, silence, frost, and firelight. Through stories passed like bread, and truths spoken only in sleep. You have listened well, and that is no small thing. We are not the ones who shape history. We are the ones who carry it, quietly, on our backs, in our hands, and finally, in our rest. Let me remind you of what you already know, that peace does not shout. It does not demand. It does not arrive with form, lags, or horns. It grows. It grows in the space between your heartbeat and the memory of a door left open on a warm night. You have heard many names. Lady Eleanor, Sir Emmerich, the boy who planted the seed, the girl who called the moon her sister. But let me tell you a secret. The most important name in the story was yours. You were there when the frost fell. You felt the fear. You walked the path. And when the light stayed, you stayed with it. Not everyone carries history in the same way. Some carry it in scars, others in songs. Some carry it in silence. Some in the way they set a table, or tie their boots, or look at snow as if it might forgive them. But everyone carries something. And you, dear listener, you carry it now too. Not on your shoulders, not in your voice, in your breath, in your pause, in the way you have stayed with me until this very moment. The past is not behind you. It walks beside you, like a shadow that no longer frightens, but follows like an old friend. You have walked with me a long time, longer than most do, longer than many can. And for that, I'm grateful. Let me ask you one last thing. When you wake, what will you carry forward? Not the names, not the years, not the snow, but the feeling of shelter, of warmth, of knowing that the fire stayed lit even when the wind howled. Let me tell you what I believe. I believe in stories that do not need to be told aloud. Stories kept in the way you close a door gently, in how you wait before speaking, in how you rest your hand on a friend's back and ask nothing in return. I believe in quiet things. I believe that sleep is a form of remembering, that your heartbeat knows more than history books, that the light outside your window is not the sun, but the memory of every fire you've ever lit when the world went dark. And if you ever feel alone, if the nights grow long again, listen. Somewhere inside you, a voice like mine will say, "You are not alone. You are not lost. You are part of the long peace. Come closer. Let the world fall away. Let the frost be distant. Let the light be low. You are safe here. I have told you all I can. The rest is yours to live. But before I go, let me give you something I never received in my hardest winters. Permission. You have permission to be soft, to sleep deeply, to leave some things unfinished, to wake when you are ready. You have permission to be slow, to be kind to yourself, to be uncertain. You do not need to carry everything. Only what brings you warmth. Take a slow breath now. Let it remind you of the forest, of the fields, of the place where the snow melted first. That breath belongs to you. So does the peace within it. You have walked the story. You have tended the fire. Now, let your limbs be heavy. Let your thoughts be slow. Let your eyelids fall like leaves in autumn. There is no lesson left. No battle left. No cold left. Only stillness. Only the long, golden quiet. And if you need me again, I will be where stories wait to be told. Where fires burn low, but never out. Where night meets memory, and you are always welcome. If I could leave a single thing behind for you, it would not be a word. Not a tale. Not even a memory. It would be this. A flame. Small. Steady. Unseen by most. But always with you. You will not always need my voice, and that is a good thing. You will not always remember every name, every chapter, every turning of the seasons. That is good, too. Because what matters has already taken root. Not in your mind, but in your breath. In the space between your heartbeat and your rest. You have listened well. You have stayed. You have softened. And now, you may sleep. Let the night be kind. Let your dreams be warm. Let your body forget the weight of waking. You have earned this rest. And when the wind brushes your window, and the stars press against your ceiling, and the quiet curls at your feet like a faithful dog, remember this. You are part of the long peace now, and nothing can take that from you. The story ends, the fire dims, and I, Edric Solen, keeper of quiet stories, I will sit by the last embers and wait for the next one who needs the light.